Welcome to the Bible Connection Podcast, the show that provides commentary and encouragement as you work your way through our Bible reading plan. I'm Brandon Stooksbury, and today we are talking about the book of James. Tonight, we have our regulars on the podcast, and then we've taken the time to study and answer some questions. This week, we have Taylor Babcock.
Hello.
John Stanky.
Hey there.
Tonight, Taylor is leading us in this study. Are you guys ready to get rolling?
Yeah, we're going to try to.
All right, let's get into it. The book of James is named after the person who wrote it, but there are two James in the New Testament that stand out. There is the Apostle John's brother, the sons of Zebedee, and there is James, the son of Mary, the brother of Jesus. Which James are we dealing with here, and what do we know about him?
Yeah, so James, or James the Just, as he was called, is the son of Mary and Joseph, and therefore the brother of Jesus. He's not to be confused with the other two, as just mentioned, so the son of Alphaeus and the son of Zebedee. Those are different James, and we need to make sure that we know that this is the brother of Jesus. So you read in Matthew 13, I think verse 55, is not this the carpenter's son, talking about Jesus? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? You notice that in listing Jesus' brothers, James is listed first. And this is an indication that he was actually the oldest brother that Jesus had, or of the rest of them. So we believe, based on that account, that is why. So James, if you read in Acts 12, you see that he's contacted by Peter, and then again in Acts 15, you read that he is the chairman of the Jerusalem church. So we also, once again, read in Galatians that he's referred to as an elder of the church. So given his position, he is believed to have been involved in the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem, which was about 48 or 50 A.D. And since there's no mention of this council, I'd say in writing this letter that is believed to be before that 48 to 50 A.D. range, so probably in the mid-40s. Therefore, we know that he was a leader of the Jerusalem church, or the church in Jerusalem, and that according to extra-biblical records, he was executed in 62 A.D. So it's very well documented, and there's information about him outside of the scriptures, as you read from Flavius Josephus. So he assembled a Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. So we see in extra-biblical accounts that he is recorded. There's, I think, a little debate who is writing this, and we know that he's the brother of Jesus. So in what he is writing, and I kind of want to couple this together, you'll notice that some of the other letters are, particularly the Pauline ones, are written to a very Gentile audience. We see that James is writing to a very Jewish audience. So as we read in the opening verse, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, the 12 tribes is most definitely in reference to a Jewish audience. Given 12 tribes, you read all of the Old Testament, that's what it's from. Furthermore, as we read in verse 2 of chapter 2, we see that they are part of a synagogue. Maybe in your translation it says assembly, but it's the word for synagogue as translated into our English translations. So his target audience was a Jewish Christian, or Jewish Christians who had been dispersed or separated from the Jerusalem church. So think about people getting moved all out from the epicenter and moving concentrically out from that area.
Yeah, I was about to say, in a sense, that's the whole church, right? Because
yes. So
go ahead. I didn't know if you were going to bring up, but in the book of Acts, we see that the gospel began in Jerusalem, and then it spread to Judea, and then Samaria, and then out to the ends of the earth. So
exactly, and that was my point I was about to make. So exactly what John just said. The audience here is not just there, but concentrically it moved out to the rest of the world. So he's writing to Christians. James often cites, and as you read through the book, the Torah and the Proverbs, and he's talking about living faithfully to God despite the persecution and poverty, given this context of what has just happened. And this all fits within that context of his Jewish audience. So despite being written to Jewish Christians, and we need to make sure that we're taking into account that the letter is for all Christians and profitable for our faith.
All right. James begins by encouraging the readers to count it all joy when they meet trials. What is a trial? What is a temptation? And how does James explain these things for us?
This is one that I recently was talking about with some middle schoolers at one of our Disciple Now weekends. We had a passage that was talking about, our faith being tested, which we see here in verses 2 and 3. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. There's this confusion that can pop up where we think when God's testing us, it's like, well, does God know what we're going to do? Like God's testing us, so, he doesn't know if we're going to be faithful or not. It could kind of go either way. God just doesn't know. That's not the kind of testing that's in mind when we're talking about trials. A trial, a test, think of it more like testing metal. When you're testing metal, when you heat it up, you're more of like proving out what it's really made of. You could almost think of it as like refining out the impurities, and what comes out the other end is a metal that's now useful, clear, clean, and is actually what it really was meant to be in the first place. And so when we see these trials that is being talked about, in verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. We should understand trials that way, which is a little different than temptations, which, a lot of times Christians get equally confused and even burdened by the idea of when they're being tempted. And James does a great job of laying out for us what to understand about temptation. Temptation begins inside of you. Temptation is when your own desires, your own heart is enticed by sin, is lured out into sinful action. And God does not tempt people. He tests people through trials, but temptation is not the work of God. And so I think that that's an important distinction that we're encouraged as we read through the first 18 verses of James to see the distinction between those things.
And James continues in his letter by contrasting the doers of the word with those who hear, but do not do. What should we take away from this contrast?
So the primary theme of James is to be a doer of the word and not just a hearer. So we read in James 2, verses 14 through 17, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, it does not have works, is dead. So some people reading James and the Pauline letters have concluded that they are in contradiction to one another, but they would say that Paul makes the argument for faith alone we receive grace, whereas James says works are required. In that same passage, James says, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. So Paul and James are in agreement. Faith without works is dead. The audiences they're speaking to are different, and they're addressing the different audiences, and therefore James is writing from a different perspective and showing the practicality of what faith is and what it looks like. Thus, they conclude that we are both saved by faith alone, but practically that there is an absolute necessity to be a doer of the things that you say, for without doing those things, it is dead. So, and one's faith is only genuine if it's accompanied by works, not that works themselves amount to one's own salvation.
Brandon opened his Bible app on his phone, and it was already reading to him, which it's kind of hard to get onto for. It means you've been listening to God's word.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
What were you saying, Taylor?
What was I saying? I was talking.
Let's rewind the tape.
I was talking about. Let's see. We're talking about faith and works and being a doer of the word, not just a hearer. And it's James, I think, in my opinion, outlines this more plainly than anywhere else I read in the scriptures. that the essentialness and the importance of not just having a head knowledge of the things that you know about the scriptures, but rather taking them and applying them in a sense that's practical and is a demonstration of your faith. You see so many examples of the Old Testament that are a demonstration of their faith. Abraham with going to the altar with Isaac, and is a demonstration of their faith. And we see numerous times through King David, and we see so many different examples of that. And when we get to the New Testament and these believers, sometimes I think there is this idea that you can have a head knowledge of what the scriptures say, but if you just, like the example that James gives, be warm, but you don't give them a coat, do you really have that faith, and are you being a doer of what you've been called? So I think James is outlining that and showing the essentialness of you can't divorce the two of your actions and what you believe. You have to do both.
Yeah, and this reminds me in the Old Testament, you have the gleaning laws, right? Where Israel is told to, as they are harvesting their fields, don't harvest up to the edges and in the corners. For the sojourners, for the widows, the orphans, that in when Israel is being taken into exile, one of the reasons is because they have neglected. They are supposed to be a kingdom of priests, a lot to the nations, all of these things, but yet they have, within their own borders, within their own people, they have neglected widows and orphans, right? And I find it interesting that James picks up on this in right before what you were just reading there. It kind of leads into what you were just saying, that religion that is pure and undefiled before God, God the Father, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their afflictions and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So pretty interesting that Israel's problem that led them into exile, James is encouraging the church that one of the marks of true religion is doing what Israel failed to do and caused them to go into exile.
I can't remember if it is the feeding of the 5,000 or the 4,000. I think it's the 5,000. I'm trying to flip to find it real quick, but it makes me think of Jesus had just fed 5,000 men, and immediately after that, the disciples are in the boat complaining and grumbling about where they're going to get food next. And they literally just saw Jesus feed like thousands of people, and then they don't get it and they don't sink in. So they have the head knowledge that Jesus is the bread of life. He's the one that is providing all this stuff for them, but it's not practical, and they're not living out in such a way that shows that they actually believe that. So Jesus goes and he finds a blind man, spits and in his eyes, and then heals the blind man, and the blind man can see. And then he's making the point that exactly what James is saying here, that if you are one who has a head knowledge of something but don't live it out, or don't actually live in such a way that shows actions of your faith, then it's meaningless. And I think that example in Matthew with the feeding of the 5,000 shows that the disciples were in error, and they weren't where they needed to be, and they needed to live out accordingly.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed as I'm looking at the book of James too is that he's taking his knowledge of the Old Testament. He's immersed with the Proverbs and the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, and he's bringing it into what he's probably heard growing up from Jesus his entire life. When you look at the teachings of Christ in Matthew, we see if you look at the book of James, after the first chapter, I think we can see 12 different chunks, 12 different passages where he's building out on some of the teachings that Jesus gave in the book of Matthew, and is giving instruction to the churches. We have the Bible broken up for us into chapters, which that's a useful tool because that way we can quickly reference for each other where we're reading, but they're not original. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4 of James, like that wasn't an original way that the text was broken up. And one way that I've seen scholars break it down, it doesn't mean that this is necessarily what James had in mind, is these 12 different sections that are referencing the teachings of Jesus. And as we're talking about James 2:14 through 26, where it's talking about you have faith and I have works, but faith apart from works is dead. It brings to attention for me Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. If that passage has ever given you fear in the middle of the night, it's like, is that going to be me? I encourage you to look at this here in James, where James is building out from there and explaining what it means to be the person who claims to follow the Lord but doesn't do what the Lord asks of you. You know, this passage gives us the encouragement that if we obey the Lord in faith, then He will know us.
Okay, so we've talked about chapter 2. James spends some time in chapter 3 talking about taming the tongue and having wisdom. Why is it important to master our speech and to seek wisdom?
Well, in chapter 3, verse 13, he says, Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. And so I've already referenced a minute ago how he's talking about the wisdom that comes from a knowledge of God. He's pulling from Proverbs. He's pulling from the Old Testament, and he's trying to show them that the wisdom that you have when you are boasting in your own understanding and your own knowledge of God is empty. It's earthly. It's unspiritual. It's demonic. But wisdom from above is pure, peaceful, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy. It's sincere. And I think that this is in reference to some of the things that Christ outlines in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5, verses 3 through 11, Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. We can see that the wisdom of God is not apart from His blessings. If you want to know where the wisdom of God comes from, it's from those who are in His in right standing with Him, in His blessings. And so I think that's one of the ways He emphasizes wisdom. What about taming of the tongue, Taylor? Do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, and I wanted to add on to that too. So James, he establishes the general principles that small things can cause great results. We'll look at an example just one second. Then more specifically applies this to the power of the tongue. And we see like a boat rotor and how it's able to steer a boat, but then we see a tongue in the same fashion. A small piece can steer a large instrument or many people. And we see that James is using this in such a way to show the positive and negative effects of what the tongue can do. Now, I do want to say, like, in James, you'll notice that there are many imperatives. So there are 108 verses in all of James. Out of that 108, 50 of them are imperatives. They're directing you to, is a call to action to do things. So James, we see so much of this in taming the tongue in this section that we see about. And recognizing the way that James writes his letter, he uses it as a diatribe. And a diatribe is something, is a type of literature in which it's an imaginary dialogue with a question and answer format, or a question and answer construction in which you would ask a hypothetical question in which you think your audience would ask had they been there, and then you go ahead and answer it for them. And
Paul does this in Romans.
Yes,
yeah.
He absolutely does. Yeah. And the reason you would do that is you don't have instant messaging. You can't just text someone or email them and have that, and it would take a long time to go back and forth. So understanding that there would be a lot of questions asked, to go ahead and just ask them and answer them for that. So within that context, there are many different sayings and a collection of wisdom literature with like throughout James that you read about. A lot of it is pulled from, as John has been referencing, the Sermon on the Mount. We see a lot of the Proverbs, and then we go all the way back to Torah, that James is referencing this and asking questions that he may answer with those questions, with answers from the Sermon on the Mount or the Proverbs. And we see the taming of the tongue fit into that context in which there are directives and actions that need to be taken accordingly so.
All right. James concludes his letter with a warning to resist the devil and to remain steadfast in suffering. How are we to accomplish these things?
So I like the verse in chapter 4, verse 17. It says, "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." So I'd like to say the obedience is the hallmark of a true child of God, and God has called us for good works. So as we read throughout his letter, we need to take heed to the warnings against worldliness, as you read in chapter 4 and on through 5. And through this diatribe that he's posing questions and answering them. Is anyone suffering? In chapter 5, verse 13, is anyone suffering? Let him pray. We see so many of these things you can either be worldly and pursue that, or you can be in the Spirit, follow him, and be obedient to God's word. And through that obedience, you are resisting the devil.
Yeah, and Brandon mentioned before, we always go over the questions before the podcast begins just to make sure that we're prepared. And he mentioned, like, okay, well, we're supposed to resist the devil and he'll flee from us. But, like, what does that mean? What does that look like? What to resist the devil? And one of the things I'd like to draw your attention to is that we don't take that in isolation, but we read what he's saying as a whole. He says to them, "You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? And whoever wishes to be a friend with the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose it's no purpose at all that the Scripture says he yearns jealously over the Spirit he's made to dwell in us?" I want to bring you back to Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, where we see, "No one can serve two masters. He will either hate the one and love the other, or to be devoted to the one and despise the other." And here, James is showing us what it means to resist the devil. It means to despise him. What are the actions of the devil? Greed, contentiousness, bitterness, arguing, lying, deceit. How do we follow the Lord, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. And so when we're going to see what it's like to resist the devil, look at the beginning of the verse. Submit yourselves to God and resist the devil. If we're going to resist the devil, we need to begin by submission and obedience to God's word. And that's what's going to lead us away from the temptations that we saw James explaining at the beginning.
All right, so that brings us to the end of this week's Bible Connection podcast. Thank you so much for everyone who took the time to listen this week and do a little different. Want to end with the benediction from Numbers chapter 6. Yahweh bless you, keep you. Yahweh make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Thank you for listening.